In 2000, Games Workshop released one of its best game systems, Warmaster, a 10mm big battle game set in their classic Warhammer fantasy universe. Warmaster had all the right ingredients to be a huge hit. A legendary designer, a ready-made audience, simple but innovative rules, and a great price point. Yeah, you probably didn't expect to hear that last bit, did you? Games Workshop has long been known for its premium, some might say exorbitant, pricing, but back in the 2000s, a player could get into Warmaster for half the price of its 28mm relative, Warhammer. And yet, despite all of these favorable tailwinds, Warmaster failed to take off. Games Workshop pulled most of its support in just a few years, and they formally abandoned the game in 2013 by closing down the entire Specialist Games division. Today on Little Wars TV, we're going to ask why. Let's explore the promising rise, perplexing fall, and surprising resurgence of Warmaster. And no one is more central to that story than the man who single-handedly willed Warmaster into existence, legendary game designer Rick Priestley.
It must have been mid to late 80s. There was a plan at Games Workshop to do a epic version of fantasy, because we'd just done the epic version of 40k with Space Marine. And Richard Halliwell picked it up. Quite a lot of things at the time got started and didn't get finished, particularly if Hal was involved, Richard Halliwell, because he was a great starter and not a very good finisher. But that was the first time I remember us actually approaching the idea. So it was epic Warhammer.
The concept for Warmaster lay dormant for years, until a surprise trip to the United States provided a spark of inspiration, specifically a trip to America's most famous battlefield.
But one of the things that happened on that trip was we got to go out and see a few American Civil War battlefields. And when I went into the Gettysburg Museum, they had a big diorama. I don't know if they still have it. It was a room, and it had a model of the entire battlefield. And it was absolutely fascinating. And they dimmed the lights, and then they showed all the positions of all the troops with little lights. And it was just really intriguing to see it as a concept. And I thought that would make a really interesting basis for a war game. Let's have a game where instead of the combat being the random element, which Warhammer essentially is, let's have a game where essentially your movement is randomized because it's based on that imperfect knowledge and orders. Put all work into the command system. It's going to be a command top-down view. So the original game, as it was conceived, was going to have a fortress in it, some siege engines, and it was going to be it was going to use the idea of a siege. I always imagined it as being kind of Warhammer but writ large. But Tom Kirby, my boss, had a very, he had this real, I'd say being his bonnet's a bit unfair, but he had this really strong opinion. That version of the game didn't actually go any further, because what happened at that time was the sales companies all decided that they couldn't have another epic. The message came back that they weren't prepared to support another epic scale game.
I can't remember quite how it got there overall, but the decision was made to do a new edition of Epic. And me and Jervis worked on Epic 40,000 as it was released, which was more of an abstract departure from Space Marine 2nd edition. And it did not land well, because basically it upset the existing players who already liked 2nd edition. And it didn't really draw in particularly many new players because they weren't lit up by what was effectively a fairly abstract system. So now we mucked that one up something fierce and basically killed Epic. So yeah, and that had, as we know now, unfortunate consequences in that Rick had an epic scale fantasy game, Warmaster, I won't call it Warhamster, Warmaster, that he was all set to go with, and the board at GW basically said, no, Epic 40,000 fell on its face, so we're not going to let you do that. we're going to tell you what else to do instead. You're going to do Gorka Morka.
When Gorka Morka was hurriedly released in 1998, it usurped the planned release spot of Warmaster. Had it not been for the perceived failure of Epic 40,000, Warmaster would have received a big, splashy starter box with 8mm plastic armies, a proper castle, and siege engines. Sadly, this would never come to pass. But given all the development that Rick Priestley had already invested into Warmaster, he was determined to release it somehow, even if GW's big boss at the time, Tom Kirby, had killed the box set. Rick started to think about workarounds and a smaller scale release. He reimagined the game as a softcover rulebook with 6 different armies cast in white metal. You could buy High Elves, Empire Dwarves, Chaos Orcs, and Undead, now in 10mm scale instead of the original 8. Metal spin casting has a much cheaper initial startup cost than expensive plastic injection tooling. But while this plan was far more economical to get going, Warmaster's white metal miniatures did have long-term drawbacks.
That had an implication as well. That meant in the end that the margins on the packets that I designed, because I designed it to be a unit goes in a packet, sells for £5. Suddenly it was, we can't sell these for £5 because we're not getting good enough casting rates. They've got to be £6, and then £7, and then £8. Oh, geez. And that doesn't seem very much money nowadays. But in those days, it was quite significant. And it started to look like it was an expensive option rather than I wouldn't say cheap, but it didn't look like the easy collectible option that it had, that I'd imagined it would be. In many ways, that's why the Warmaster project was done the way it was. It was done as a book because we couldn't afford to do it in different languages in the big box game at that time. And it was the relative expense of it was simply because the volumes of production were so much higher.
In 2000, 2 years after its intended release, Games Workshop finally published Rick Priestley's passion project, Warmaster. There was no starter box or splashy marketing push, but the rules were very well received, and they created a fun, highly playable mass battle experience. It's a command and control exercise where issuing orders to your units is the central focus. The game was featured in White Dwarf, as well as its own Specialist Games standalone magazine. This magazine included army building articles, terrain tutorials, scenarios, and fan support. Its players loved the game system, but would a large enough segment of the Warhammer fantasy crowd be willing to give 10mm scale a try?
Well, it did all right, but it didn't do fantastically well because there wasn't the real enthusiasm for it within the sales companies. It was one of these things that I think there was a lot of kind of love for Warhammer amongst the sales teams, particularly the guys in the stores and the older guys. And I think they saw Warmaster as being kind of like, why am I interested in Warmaster? Because I'm interested in Warhammer. I don't think it was enthusiastically embraced as it might have been. Previously, in a previous incarnation of Games Workshop, you employed shop staff and they were just hobbyists. And they loved everything because we sold everything. And then after that 1991 buyout, and to some extent before that, we were starting to get professional within the sales company. And I think within that context, the guys just found having more and more things to do quite difficult. It was asking a lot of them. So every store had to have an expert in Warhammer, and every store had to have an expert in 40k. But to ask every store to be an expert in every other game was probably a bit much. There were certain games which were very popular amongst the staff. Warhammer 40k and Blood Bowl. They loved Blood Bowl, and the reason they loved Blood Bowl was because it was so easy to get into. You need to hunt down somebody who worked in a Games Workshop store at the time and ask them.
I'm Northern Exile. I worked at Games Workshop for a few years, only 3 years now. My first month working for GW, we were selling Blood Bowl. They had just come out again. And my first couple of weeks were literally teaching people how to play Blood Bowl. I love specialist games. They were the bread and butter of GW's products. That's what they used to do. They used to make games. These days, they make Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar. The first store I worked in was with 2 other staff members, and even then, you barely had time to run intro games. Like you had to pick and choose who you gave an intro game to, because it was busy. If somebody wanted to come in and play Epic or play Blood Bowl, we were heavily suggested to say, look, go and find a club to play that in. Yeah, this is a storefront. We don't really do that. So it's all about that economy of time and effort. And if you gave a store manager Warmaster back in the day, Rick's right, he'll be in the back room somewhere. Like it's not getting put on the shelf unless he's absolutely told to. They're putting it in the back or underneath the till. You know, it's just someone who's been there. Like I know how hard they work. Like they work slavishly.
So it seems we have our first bit of anecdotal confirmation for one of Rick Priestley's leading theories about why Warmaster failed to take off. Overworked store managers and shop staff were being told to focus on pushing flagship products, namely Warhammer 40k, as their top KPI, or key performance metric. That didn't leave much time or shelf space for specialist games like Mordheim, Epic, Battlefleet Gothic, or Warmaster. It didn't matter how good these games were, and yes, they were among GW's best. What mattered was selling more Space Marines. Even so, puzzling questions do remain. If Warmaster was a good game based on a flagship IP, why did Warhammer Fantasy players fail to embrace it? Plenty of theories have been floated over the years. The 10mm scale was too small, and hobbyists were intimidated to paint it. The price was too expensive. Just a moment ago, you heard Rick Priestley raise that exact concern. Or maybe it was the lack of that proper big box starter set.
I think if Warmaster had a boxed set release, that would have attracted the fan attention that other games had. If you could have opened that box and had 2 armies ready to go in plastic without having to spend hundreds of pounds, dollars to collect a sizable army, that definitely would have given it the entry-level aspect that I think it lacked. And selling blister packs is not as exciting as selling great big box sets.
Ian Standing is one of the only YouTubers actively creating content for Warmaster, and he's been a player since the game was released over 20 years ago. Ian and fans like him have long rationalized some combination of these arguments. Warmaster's figure scale is often highlighted as a barrier for attracting new players. Specialist games like Necromunda and Mordheim simply allowed players to recycle some of their existing 28mm models for easy crossover. But to try Warmaster, a player would need to start over in a foreign scale, a scale that some might perceive as harder to paint due to the tiny size, or more time-consuming, due to the sheer number of models in an army. There's also the question of visual appeal in a shop window.
I think we need to look at the visual dynamics. So somebody walking past the window, or somebody walking through the store, if they see a Primaris Space Marine fighting an Orc, they're like, "Ooh, wow, look at those army of Space Marines there." If they walk past and they see the same similar battle, but in Warmaster, they're going, "What's that?" And you have to get quite close to figure out what's going on, who's who, you know. I don't think a kid who's 10 to 15 is going to come in and go, "I want the epic miniature."
I don't want to dismiss legitimate drawbacks to smaller scales, but I don't find them entirely convincing. And neither did Games Workshop at the time. Remember, Warmaster was not their first foray into tiny models. Before Epic 40,000's flop, GW did very well with Space Marine and Titan Legions, 2 8mm scale plastic box sets. Players didn't complain about painting 8mm scale Space Marines back then, and sales were strong enough to convince Games Workshop to greenlight not 1, but 2 8mm scale follow-ups in the late 1990s. As for the visual appeal that North mentioned a moment ago, that's subjective, of course. An individual 10mm model does not catch the eye like a Primarch does, but en masse, the sight of vast miniature armies duking it out for control of a castle looks pretty damn cool to me. The notion that Warmaster was too expensive is not a subjective argument. It is objectively incorrect. You can open up an old Games Workshop catalog and see the numbers for yourself. Here is the 2004 sales catalog. To get started in Warmaster, you needed to buy a starter army, which cost $45. To be fair, that's barely enough miniatures for a game. Practically, you'd want at least 2 of those boxes for a reasonable force, plus a few blister packs for unit variety and some characters. And remember, this is Games Workshop we're talking about, so the rulebook will set you back another $40. That's a total entry cost of $146, so not cheap. But if you were a savvy mail-order customer, Games Workshop did offer a better deal, a $96 Army Pack bundle. Honestly, it's hard to even find pictures of this product on the internet these days, which isn't too much of a surprise because GW did not market these bundles at all. Teenage me remembers them being nearly impossible to find. I don't even know if they were available in stores, which is a shame because for $96, not only did you get a playable force with heroes, you also got the rulebook. Even if you did get that savings, you'd also need a friend to spend the same amount. But what if you wanted to play Warhammer Fantasy in classic 28mm scale? What would a 6th edition Empire army cost you? Here is the Warhammer 2004 boxed set, Empire and Orcs. It's $75, which is a pretty good deal for 2 forces and a rulebook with game aids. But take a closer look, because you only get 2 Empire units and a cannon. That's not even close to enough for a real game, and it doesn't include your Empire Army book. For a true apples-to-apples comparison with our Warmaster army, a new Empire player in 2004 would want that $75 starter box, the $20 Empire Army book, a $90 battalion for additional models, and of course, a hero. Lords and heroes are the backbone of Warhammer, so if you want an elector count on a Griffin, and who are you kidding, of course you do, that model alone is $35. So where are we? Oh yeah, $220. That's for a modestly sized army with basic core units. No rare or special units. If you wanted a steam tank in 28mm, that was $60 per tank. In Warmaster, $10, 1/6 the price. Make no mistake, Warmaster was not too expensive. Compared to Warhammer Fantasy, you could get into the 10mm mass battle game for half the entry price. So if cost wasn't what killed Warmaster, what did? Perhaps it was the lack of a starter box, with 2 armies in plastic. Surely a starter box would have helped the game's popularity. That's beyond question. But how much? Because as it turns out, Rick Priestley got a second bite at the apple in 2005. And he did convince his bosses to do a fabulous Warmaster box set. It just wasn't branded as Warmaster.
We'd done the Lord of the Rings deal with New Line Cinema. And to extend the license, we did this same deal with Tolkien Enterprises in California. We only really wanted the Lord of the Rings, but we had to take the Hobbit as well. But the provision was we had to do a game based on the Hobbit to justify having the license. It was part of the license deal. We had to do a game based on the Hobbit. So I thought, well, I know what I could do. Why don't we do the Battle of Five Armies as a Warmaster game? And I think at the time I was really kind of into Warmaster.
The Battle of the Five Armies boxed set provided players complete opposing armies in plastic, along with a Middle-earth themed Warmaster rulebook. The price was remarkably good. You could buy the entire box for £50, or about $80 at the time. Well, if you could find a copy, that is.
Yeah, the shop staff actually were told not to sell it, and in the UK, they were selling it under the counter. I'm not sure if it was literally in a brown paper bag, but I have no idea.
That was the attempt to kind of market the game to the Lord of the Rings crowd. Now, of course, Games Workshop had invested so much time and money into promoting their Lord of the Rings game, I think that possibly explains why the focus was not on the other smaller Fanatic games, and Warmaster was kind of left in the shadow of the big third game was Lord of the Rings, so Warmaster's got to wait in the corner. And the attempt to promote the Battle of Five Armies was, I think, a result of that, perhaps. Again, that never really took off. You can get it as a collector's item on eBay, but that's a perfectly serviceable set of rules based on the core Warmaster game itself, but just set in the world of The Hobbit.
On the surface, the failure of the Battle of the Five Armies box set seemed utterly inexplicable. Here was a complete box at a fantastic price, with a great game system written by a veteran game designer set in Tolkien's universe. And remember, this is 2005, when Lord of the Rings fever was still running red hot at Games Workshop. All the ingredients for a massive Warmaster revival seemed ready-made to explode. Except it very much did not. What happened? The answer may surprise you.
I sold it to the management on the basis of it being, this will answer our licensing problem, we'll get this out of the way, and this will enable us to do some testing on these scenery pieces. So all in all, yes, it might be not viable as a product in the same way as other products, but it's a good piece of R&D, which I think it was.
So there you have it. The Battle of the Five Armies Warmaster box set was never a product Games Workshop believed in from the start. It was done only by necessity and convenience, to retain the Tolkien license. Just the cost of doing business.
I think Warmaster was, in many ways, both the victim and the expression of all the changes that were going on. You have to remember, when we did the buyout in 1991, I think it was, I think the company was bought for £10 million, or thereabouts. Might have been low teens, like 14 million, something like that. The money was all borrowed from venture capitalists. So Tom, who had borrowed it and put his house up and everything he owned up, basically skin in the game. Good on him, really. And that meant that we owed £14 million as a management team. So that focuses the mind quite a bit. It's like having a mortgage for £14 million. So we basically had to generate £1 million profit every year to pay the interest on that loan. So we couldn't just continue as we were. We had to grow, and we had to grow fast. So we did.
Under Tom Kirby's aggressive, debt-fueled leadership, Games Workshop did grow at a remarkable rate. But cracks began to emerge in the mid to late 2000s. Big cracks. The questionable business decisions made by Tom Kirby's executive team are beyond the scope of today's video. But suffice it to say, corporate changes had to be made, and fast.
Unfortunately, what happened was that Games Workshop hit a kind of bump in the road and had a particularly tough year or two, really. And savings needed to be made. Really across the board at Games Workshop. So quite a lot of people got, departments were downsized, basically. And the decision was made that the specialist games was, it was just too much of a resource. It wasn't, the just downsizing, it wouldn't really help terribly much. What would be better would be to let some people go. And basically that's what happened. So Fanatic got shut down, and that was a very tough time.
According to Jervis Johnson, the Specialist Games division was profitable, but not generating the same margins as the core business. The entire division was shuttered in 2013, effectively killing fan favorites like Battlefleet Gothic, Necromunda, Blood Bowl, Mordheim, and, of course, Warmaster.
Warmaster is cool, and I wish it took off, because you look at how Total War Warhammer took off. Loads of people play that, and that's essentially Warmaster. It's not tabletop, old world. That's Warmaster you're playing. Battle of Blackfire Pass. You can't really do that in old world. You can simulate a part of it, but in Warmaster you can do the Battle of Blackfire Pass, the whole thing.
Games Workshop abandoned Warmaster, but its global fan base had other ideas.
Hello, my name's Ian Standing, and I'm the owner of the YouTube channel of the same name, Ian M. Standing, which is primarily focused on the tabletop miniatures game called Warmaster. Essentially, you had the original Warmaster rules, which were published by Games Workshop 25 years ago. You can still find that original rulebook. That went through a series of updates through fan-based editions, through the War Mag, I think, and the Fanatic magazine over the years, until that finally tailed off in the year 2009. So certain players decided, we want to keep this game going, we want to make it viable, so let's just keep this moving forward. That coalesced about 10 or so years ago now into what was essentially the Warmaster Rules Committee, a collection of amateur players that want to keep the game alive. And Warmaster Revolution arose from that, just a mishmash of ideas and people coming together with good ideas of how the game could be improved. It also borrows heavily from the historical version of Warmaster, which was actually written by Rick Priestley, called Warmaster Ancients.
I'm Paul. I'm one half of the Warmaster podcast.
Okay, so I'm Barry. I'm the other half of the Warmaster podcast. We do talk about Warmaster sometimes. It's just
we do, yeah.
After 194 episodes, you mind all the easy diamonds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, and I'm also the chairman of the Warmaster Rules Committee, the Revolution Rules Committee.
I think it's pretty clear when Rick Priestley gives interviews about it that he loved the game. He was like, he loved designing it and he loved what it was. And I think it might have been a throwback to a better time, well, a different time of Games Workshop where they allowed games to flourish, more organically happen.
So I think he had complete creative control. Yeah. I think the biggest hurdle to Warmaster is whether somebody can handle mentally the fact that when they pick up those dice, they may not be able to give the order.
Yeah.
Because most war games, you just
do what you do. You do what you're told to do.
These guys go here.
Everything has complete control.
If you can get past those little things about the command and stuff, there has never been a better time to play Warmaster, because you could print off a Warmaster army for literally nothing. They're so small that, I mean, even the print time is so small. It's like 40 minutes to print a bed because they're so short.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can literally pennies.
Yeah. No, I mean,
you could seriously print a 2,000 point army for £3 worth of resin, I reckon.
Printing your own Warmaster army from a designer like Forest Dragon or Wakes Emporium may cost you a few quid, but downloading a current edition of Warmaster Revolution will cost you nothing. The fan community has the entire rulebook and army compendium available for free, and it looks fantastic. We used these rules for our Helm's Deep wargame in the club, and playing this game brought back so many old memories from 20 years ago. And what does the game's original designer, Rick Priestley, think of Warmaster Revolution carrying on the baton?
So I have seen Warmaster Revolution, and it's really quite touching. They're still going, it's great. But I think Warmaster actually did strike a chord, and I think went on to influence various other games.
Warmaster's DNA can be found in many familiar game systems that followed, including Hail Caesar, Black Powder, Blitzkrieg Commander, and many more. That legacy, along with the engaged player base 20 years later, speaks volumes about its lasting success. No, it did not sell enough copies to move the needle at Games Workshop, but very few games did. In that sense, all of the specialist games that GW killed could be deemed financial failures, otherwise the company would have kept producing them. Of course, that's an unfair assessment. Blood Bowl and Necromunda remain so popular and so widely played that Games Workshop did an about-face and officially brought both of them back from the dead, publishing new editions. The most recent specialist game to be revived is Epic 40K, which has a fancy new name, but is the same epic scale concept. Will Warmaster be next? Rick Priestley doesn't think so, and if you listen to the current players in the Warmaster community, they seem just fine keeping it that way.
In terms of will Games Workshop take an interest in Warmaster in the future? Part of me wants to say I really hope not, because we kind of got a good thing going on at the moment. As a fan-based community, they're clearly aware of us because they've made contact with us, but they've left us alone pretty much for the last 10 years. So if they were to come in and say, right, it's our IP, we're taking it back off you now, guys, see ya, I think that would be quite a hard blow for the community to accept, because we've got used to essentially doing things our way. The feedback has been largely positive, that we kind of know what we're doing. The game's in a very healthy place.
I don't think they will take it back in terms of like
It's impossible. There's no money in it.
But they have.
I reckon the market for Warmaster isn't 1% of the market for
can't
fantasy. Not even 1%.
It's very niche.
If they did try to bring it back, the 3D printing would kind of kibosh any money they're going to make out of models.
We want to thank all of our interview guests and remind you that the full-length versions will be available as free podcasts on Little Wars FM. We have nearly 5 hours of conversation about all things Warmaster. In those 5 hours, 2 explanations for Warmaster's failure to take off stood out as the most convincing. First, Rick Priestley's suspicion that the retail sales staff never pushed the game. That is undoubtedly true from the company side. But what about the customer side of the equation? Let's end today's video with Ian Standing's thought-provoking observation on why small-scale fantasy battles failed to attract 28mm scale Warhammer fans. Perhaps the crossover between those two audiences was never as strong as it may have seemed on paper.
Back in the day, as I recall it, Games Workshop's stores were usually populated by young men, so teenage boys basically, or early 20s, with a bit of disposable income. And they were tending to spend their money on the games that they enjoyed. Your big, bright, bold 40k armies, they look fantastic. You've got a slight RPG element in games like Necromunda, Blood Bowl, and Mordheim, where you get to build and develop a small little gang or team or what have you. I think that appeals more to the younger players, whereas the whole command and control aspect, it really appeals, I think, to armchair generals, which tend to be more seasoned players, older people, basically. And I think really Games Workshop were targeting their products at that time at the younger players, and didn't really see the market that Warmaster might have had.
Somewhere in Ian's answer, I think we can find the root cause of Warmaster's lack of financial success. It may have been a great game and a great concept, just not for Games Workshop's target audience. What do you think? Why did Warmaster never catch on with Warhammer's core fanbase? Let us know in the comments below. In addition to our interview guests, we want to thank Turhan Elbi for introducing us to the Warmaster Revolution community. We also encourage you to check out a YouTube channel called FilmDeg, where Tom has been interviewing the old guard from GW's early years. If you enjoy hearing stories from the guys who really built Games Workshop, guys like Rick Priestley, Jervis Johnson, Andy Chambers, Gav Thorpe, and the Perrys, you will be amazed by the number of interviews Tom has conducted just over the last few years. In fact, you can click right here to watch one of those conversations next.